Hi, everyone, and welcome to our seminar on losses and damages to social cohesion in climate vulnerable settings. My name is Salloum Lindegaard. I am a senior researcher at the Danish Institute for International Studies, and I will be starting us off today. We have a lot of interesting information and insights for you, and only an hour, so we will go ahead and get started. So here is our program for today. I will give a brief intro to the project, background, and some of our key findings. Then we'll move into insights from Ghana and Niger, and finally some policy reflections with a Q&A at the end. And as we go along, I will be introducing all of our speakers. For the Q&A, there's a Q&A function. This is not the chat function, but a different Q&A function. Please just put your questions there as we go through the webinar, and we will gather those up and answer them at the end. Thanks. So briefly about the study. This is a joint effort with the Danish Red Cross and the Danish Institute for International Studies, which is an independent research institute based in Denmark. The study itself, Displacement, Climate Change and Social Cohesion, Exploring Loss and Damage Dynamics, it emerged out of work that we were doing in the Upper West region of Ghana, myself and my co-author, Francis Jarawura, and also dynamics coming up in Niger that the Red Cross was coming across in their work. And so together we put together this study trying to understand how social cohesion losses were potentially emerging in these two contexts and how they related to different aspects of forced mobility, climate change, and development challenges. And so here you can see our report and our policy brief. We also soon have a working paper coming that provides even more data from the study that we couldn't fit into the other outputs. So those are going to be all on our website, and today we will give you some highlights. So key findings and overview here, and then we'll take them one by one. The first is really actually seeing unexpected cohesion impacts, including climate-related losses. Then we have secondary losses to material and social emotional well-being, and also some irreversible losses. And so taking those one at a time, when we're talking about unexpected cohesion impacts, with social cohesion, we generally are talking about social cohesion in areas affected by especially conflict, instability, and displacement. And this was much more the case in Niger than in Ghana. In Ghana, we were looking at sending areas in forced migration to a greater degree and severe climate impacts. But you can see that in Ghana, people perceived social cohesion to be declining to a much greater extent than our respondents in Niger. So this was really a surprise and goes against typical assumptions and kind of prevailing wisdom in social cohesion policy and also research. And so that was really interesting and really underlines the extent to which we need greater knowledge on this area in order to have informed policy and programming. And the next thing was secondary losses to material and social emotional well-being. So beyond trying to assess how people felt social cohesion was changing, we also asked them how that affected other aspects of their well-being. And here again, we see greater losses in Ghana, so greater negative impacts to material and social emotional well-being. But the important part to take out of this is really also the extent to which social losses are impacting material well-being. And this is clearly both the case in Ghana and in Niger. And I think what's important to understand here is that in these contexts, if we take Northern Ghana, for instance, social relations of mutual support and reciprocity and these kinds of social systems, they're really the bedrock of all sorts of social systems, also material ones. And so social systems, they provide disaster response and recovery, they provide food assistance, they provide access to credit, and so on. So when we see social systems coming under strain to the extent that we have been able to see in this study, we're also seeing that that really affects material well-being negatively. And finally, some irreversible losses. And so we also asked people to what extent that we felt these losses or these declines could be improved. And we have basically a third of all respondents in both countries saying only somewhat. So already now we can see that, and some respondents even, responded to a lesser extent, basically. So we're seeing that some of these losses are already perceived by those affected themselves as irreversible. So basically, we don't have a good knowledge base on this. We're seeing from this study and other early emerging studies that there are probably some very notable losses in this area, and already now some of them are perhaps irreversible. And just to give an idea of what it means for those affected, this is a quote that we gathered from our data collection in Ghana, where a 65-year-old woman in northern Ghana says the main thing affecting our togetherness in this village is the increasing flooding, making farming difficult, so most of our young men have migrated away. So there are fewer people during funeral celebrations, and no one has enough labor to help each other. Also, when they migrate seasonally and return, they're now thinking of the money, so they're no longer interested in free or reciprocal labor arrangements. And so this quote really nicely illustrates in a way how these material and social losses are interlinked and how they in some ways reinforce each other. So moving on to, going forward, and here's some main messages. I mean, the why is really this issue of probably a lot of overlooked losses out there, and which may cause misdirected responses. So main point from the study, we're seeing social cohesion losses with major social and material impacts. These do not follow expected patterns. So we need to assess to a greater degree to be able to implement well. So we need greater knowledge of this. And what we need to do going forward, we need some new thinking and also to a greater extent contextually based approaches, avoiding assumptions and one-size-fits-all approaches. And I'll say here that when we're looking at social cohesion in, kind of organizational approaches, policy approaches, also in research, these are often coming from Western contexts, the kind of definitions that we're using. And assessments have shown they don't necessarily even travel well across Western countries. So trying to take these definitions and use them in very diverse settings is probably problematic. So we need to understand what exactly affects cohesion dynamics in a particular setting and how it's understood there by those affected. In terms of the where, so this going beyond conflict and insecurity to climate affected areas. So again, with social cohesion in programming, we often see a focus on areas affected by conflict, displacement, and insecurity. And while we did see some losses in Niger, they were much clearer in Ghana, which is a setting affected by slow and sudden onset climate change, but is a sending area where migrants are leaving. So you have this forced mobility dynamic. So you don't have insecurity to the same degree, you don't have conflict to the same degree, and it's not a receiving area where you see displaced or migrants coming to, which is generally also the focus. So we need a shift here. And kind of summing up everything here, so integrated approaches basically. So we need to integrate different ideas of cohesion as we talked about. We need to involve diverse actors. So we're seeing kind of multiple challenges and how to approach those challenges in an integrated manner might require different kinds of organizations, different kinds of expertise, working at different scales locally and internationally, and obviously also involving those affected. And so the final one is this integrating material and social responses. And so we don't need to reinvent the wheel, but we can try and think how we can make existing efforts work for cohesion. And this could be including or integrating kind of a social component to existing support to livelihoods or programming more focused on resource access. Or it could be looking at a process-based approach, so changing the way that we're doing programming, just to give a couple of examples. So there we were just scratching the surface. This is an overview, and we have more information for you from Ghana and Niger coming in just a moment. That was all from me. All right. So now I would like to introduce my colleague, Francis Jarawura, who is a senior lecturer at the SD Jumbo University of Integrated Business and Development Studies in the Upper West of Ghana. So Francis, he lives and works in the Upper West, and he is an expert on development, climate, mobility in the north of Ghana. So Francis, please go ahead. The floor is yours.
Yeah, good afternoon, everyone. I'm happy to share with you some details of the insights from Ghana. So we had a site study in Ghana, in the northwestern Ghana. So this is in the upper west region of Ghana, and also very close to the border with Burkina Faso and also Cote d'Ivoire. So the entire population of the Upper West is about 868,000 people. And we specifically situated our study in the Wild West district, which is one of the sub-districts in the Upper West region, with just about 96,000 people. Most of these people are agrarian-based and mostly cultivate crops like maize and granules for their livelihoods. But much of this agriculture is based on rainfall. So this actually exposes them to rainfall vagaries and also changes in long-term patterns. Over time, we have seen that temperatures have shown clear warming trends in this region. And in Ghana, this particular region is actually said to bear the greatest burden of climate change. This is also because it has very high levels of poverty, and the rainfall pattern is a single maxima, means that all risks in the farming season is restricted to one season. So we have also seen that the frequency and intensity of climate extremes have actually increased over time. So here I have a picture that we took last year during the field work of a house that collapsed from flooding. And some of the household members had just migrated to find money to try to rebuild. So having agrarian-based livelihoods that are largely dependent on rainfall meant that when the people are affected by rainfall vagaries and also extremes like droughts and flooding and also extreme variability, they are mostly forced to move. Our study has shown that actually 2% of the households have reported experiencing displacements in the last 5 years, have had to move elsewhere to settle for a while and return later. And about 75% of these households have reported one or two of their members or more migrating when they did not really want to do so in relation to climate change. So in Ghana, the main migration pattern is moving southwards. That's where most of the capital is located. So we also have big farms there, you have manufacturing industries there, but also it's a pattern left behind by colonial authorities and is still quite dominant. But we also still do have migration in the internal savannah where the study site is located. So when we looked at social cohesion, we did realize that a little more than half of the respondents really perceived a decline in social cohesion, and they actually lamented the past. And when you look at belonging, they actually saw a decline in this, as Lily earlier reported. So this they largely attributed to uptake of capitalist ideas of farming and also out-migration due to environmental stress. So as Lily also indicated, when people migrate, then there are consequences for the home, including that of labor, reciprocity, and also in terms of how they relate to each other. Then in terms of security, we have seen that they have perceived a slight decline over the last 10 years, mainly related to livestock theft and occasional robberies. This they perceive the works of Ghanaians and also people crossing from Burkina Faso and Niger. So they are quite very emotional about this sometimes. And in terms of mutual support, we have reported that there's been some decline, and all these are actually so closely linked to climate change and also closely linked to social transformations in the society in terms of adoption of new farming systems and also commodification of land and labor. So there are changes in labor relations where communal labor is no longer common as people try to seek income and pursue their own dreams. So these quotations that I did gather depict much of this. I can read this one to you. The seasonal migrants, get too busy to find their relations and friends, as they are always looking for the thing called money. So they hardly make any good and trusted friends too. Also, because they are always on the move, they cannot be actively part of any groups of today's kind that deals in money. So it also tells us about how they are unable to relate with changes in their home, about how people now get into new groups, for example, village loans and savings associations that has been pushed up by UNICEF, and how they help each other reciprocally. So we actually then went on to ask people what they thought could help deal with this situation of losses to social cohesion in terms of financial and material well-being. A number of strategies actually were mentioned, and prominent among them are the access to financial and material support. So people thought this was very important for helping with the situation. Access to social support, they also thought was very important. So obviously the social system is breaking down, or has seen some changes that are significant to the people. And we have seen old people staying by themselves when their children have migrated. So this actually raises questions about, how younger generations take care of their older ones. So access to infrastructure and services is also seeing some very high responses. And a sense of belonging is also very important. And they thought that it was important to deal with this. Sense of trust, reliance on others in this community is also seen as a strategy that will be very useful. And as I have already mentioned, there's a reduction in this, and much of the economy and how people relate goes around informality. In terms of credit, it's much informal arrangements. So it is very important that trust and reliance on people is important. So to some conclusions, we have seen that social cohesion is on the decline. Then we have seen that several elements, including climate change, monetization of the economy, changes in labor relations, are key drivers of the whole process, thereby affecting access to labor in the traditional sense. Then we think that for a context like this, where so many people depend on informality to conduct their business, it is really important that we do much more research into how to reduce the impact on social cohesion, to understand the context much better, and to find ways of dealing with it. Yeah. Thank you.
Great, Francis. Thank you so much. And I really like that figure that you showed. It also shows this kind of integrated nature of the material and also the social well-being, because a lot of the strategies that are showed, people scored them almost the same for to what extent they would improve both material and also social well-being. So thanks for showing that. It's also part of the report. So now we will move on and we'll be hearing from Laura Bonanomi, who's a program delegate for the Danish Red Cross based in Niamey, Niger. And Laura, you've been working with the Niger Red Cross in disaster risk management, climate change, supporting resilience and adaptation work, and now driving forward loss and damage initiatives. So looking forward to hearing more. Thanks.
Yeah. Thank you very much, Lily, and thank you, Francis, as well, for a very insightful presentation. So now after Ghana, we're going to move a little bit northeast to Niger, another country in West Africa, and more particularly in a region called the Central Sahel. Niger has roughly a population of 23,600,000 people, and it's one of the biggest countries in the region. Yet, of all its inhabitants, 14 million people are currently reporting to be living in situation of extreme poverty. And according to UN OCHA, 17% of the population is in dire need of humanitarian assistance. And so while I think that more or less we're all acquainted with the humanitarian scenario present in Niger, I think it's really important to understand how these worrisome humanitarian trends are further compounded by the negative effects of climate change. And here I would really like to convey the idea of climate change as a risk multiplier, really acting and interacting with the vulnerabilities that are already in place. And just to give you a little bit of context, we're talking about a country with a very peculiar geographical position and hydromorphological profile as well. So half of the country is categorized as desertic and the southern part as a semi-arid. And we also have the El Niño Southern Oscillation, which causes really, to a great extent, year-to-year weather variability and extreme weather hazards. So already the geographical position plus all of these, and all the scientists are also unanimous in saying that the worldwide changing climate is having a negative effect on the potential natural hazards, which really do transform into disasters. And when we talk about Niger, we talk mainly about droughts and floods being the most recurrent and the most impactful disaster hazards and disaster that we do record in Niger. Moreover, the NDG Gain Notre Dame Index categorizes Niger as a country with extreme vulnerability to climate change and also with very low adaptation capacities, which of course really makes this picture even more worrisome. So now if we zoom in onto the Tillabéri region specifically, which is the region concerned by this study, the intertwining of factors becomes even more complex. Why? Because first of all, we are in the Liptako-Burma region, which is the region of the three borders with Mali and Burkina Faso. So here the chronic insecurity and the constrained humanitarian access makes interventions more difficult. And we see even more displacements of population, not only across the three borders, but within the region of Tillabéri itself. Moreover, 40% of the Niger population is concentrated into the Niger basin, the Niger River basin, which of course makes a big part of the population exposed to seasonal and more or less catastrophic events and other climatic hazards as well. And finally, I think it's really important to add to the picture that the majority of the population in Niger, and here we are as high as 80% of the population, is somewhat dependent on agricultural activities. And if we take into consideration the rising temperatures, the more erratic rainfalls, the prolonged periods of drought, as well as the losses of crops and arable land to floods, then we do understand how climate change really impacts the humanitarian situation and Niger overall. So this is also why the region of Tillabéri is a focus of attention for the Red Cross Red Crescent movement in Niger, and more specifically Niger Red Cross and the Danish Red Cross have been active in the region on multiple fronts, from migration and protection to community-based resilience. And more recently, we have turned an eye to climate-related losses and damages, with a specific attention as well to non-economic losses. So what is important to understand is the need, as Lily presented as well in her presentation, to contextualize social cohesion, because we tend to have a very general definition, but what we understood through this research as well and through the comparison of results from Ghana to Niger is the importance of contextualizing and having a localized understanding. And this is where partnering up with the Danish Red Cross and Niger Red Cross in the field has allowed to really go to a very local level of understanding, since the Niger Red Cross really does benefit from a community anchoring, as well as a communal and even village level presence. And here we have been understanding social cohesion as a sort of harmonious situation of living between different peoples and communities, be they defined by their status or origin or livelihood activity. And throughout our work, what came out very clear and prominent is that climate change and displacements do play a role and do have an impact on social cohesion. We are seeing, for example, intra and intercommunal tensions between breeders and farmers, but overall also the pressure on natural resources and the environment is increasing. And that's also when people moving from more rural areas to urban and peri-urban areas sort of enter into this dynamic of inter and intra-communal conflict. We have been working with social cohesion already in the region, reinforcing the skills of local leaders to prevent, identify, assess, and manage these type of tensions and conflicts. We've also been collaborating with the government entity for peace consolidations. And overall, what we have been trying to do, and we will keep on doing, is really to reinforce community-based mechanisms and local entities and generate evidence-based information for awareness raising as well. So within this framework, this study and this project was carried out, and this data collection really benefited our understanding of social cohesion and provided us with a very refreshing perspective. So first of all, entering into this study as as a humanitarian organization and with a very operational and hands-on understanding of what social cohesion is and what we have been seeing in the region, we thought about seeing losses overall in social cohesion or somewhat negative trends. And this is due, as I said before, to the peculiar security context that is registered in the region, but also more widely to the effects of climate change, which have been more severe in the last years. Instead, what we saw are positive trends. So especially for factors which have been positively correlated with social cohesion, mainly mutual support and sense of belonging, we have been recording gains, quite surprisingly. The only factor actually recording a slight decrease or worsening is indeed the security for the reasons I mentioned before. But then again, what we have been witnessing as well is that the impacts of social cohesion are deemed more clear or more visible by the respondents on material or economic well-being rather than social or non-economic well-being. Again, this study has been mainly quantitative. We used a quantitative methodology, so it was not possible to dig deeper into the factors and understand how these factors interact and make these gains in social cohesion possible. And possibly this will be the next step for us in order to really bolster our programming. But still, it's quite an interesting result and really refreshing as well to see. And we can make assumption as to why we have been seeing gains and a positive trend in social cohesion. This can be due to better access to resources and positive spillovers from other humanitarian interventions. Namely, I'm thinking in the field of food security or livelihoods, but also, again, to cultural dynamics at the base. So how are we taking all these results and feeding them back into our activities? So the first takeaway from this research, as I already said, but I think it's really important to underline that social cohesion needs to be contextualized and a local understanding is necessary. So if we had gone into the research with a blanket statement of what social cohesion is, we had probably been missing a lot of insights and a lot of important nuances, which differentiate as well, as we have seen Niger from Ghana and from any other countries and regions as well. So this is the first takeaway. And the second is rather a paradigm shift for us practitioners. So we have shifted from understanding social cohesion as really a potential negative trend which affects the region to a rather positive dynamic and trend that we can address and bolster through and in favor of climate action. So how is that the case? It means that by implementing activities in favor of climate change adaptation and to address losses and damages related to climate, we can also preemptively address inclusion and by extension social cohesion. And why is that? As I just said, the economic side is particularly related and visible when we talk about cohesion. So by, for example, providing resources in the field of livelihoods and food security, which is very much a necessity and a reality in the region of Tillabéri, we can also address social cohesion. Moreover, and parallelly, we will be looking at non-economic losses as well, and more particularly through psychosocial support and by addressing aspects like climate anxiety and loss of cultural identity and traditional ways of life. And while respondents identified these as slightly less visible within the social cohesion dynamics, this is still very much important and complementary to any more economic or material support that is provided to the population. So this is how the research has been able to sort of connect the dots to these three phenomena: displacement, climate change, and social cohesion, which are often really regarded as separate and not really as interacted between them. But this paradigm shift, as I just defined it, will possibly be able to improve our programming and really address the needs of the vulnerable populations in Tillabéri and more wider in Niger. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Laura. So some really interesting things coming out, and great with a practice-based perspective. And now we'll be moving on to a more policy perspective. So joining us now, we have Mary Friel, who is a senior climate officer working with policy and diplomacy for the International Federation of the Red Cross, Red Crescent Societies. Mary is joining us from the climate negotiations in Bonn, where there's been a lot of loss and damage developments going on. And so she can give us some of the latest about what's going on in this field. Over to you, Mary.
Thank you so much, and it's a real pleasure to join everyone here this afternoon, this morning, this evening, depending on where people are joining. I'm Mary Friel, and I'm the Senior Climate Policy Officer for the International Federation of the Red Cross and Red Crescent. I'm joining you from a small booth on the side of the Bonn Climate Conference, which is a technical meeting of all countries across the world here in Bonn in Germany as a halfway point towards the annual COP. So really pleased to be able to join, to be able to, I suppose, zoom back a little bit in terms of what's happening with the global climate policy processes, which are of relevance to some of the really interesting research insights, which we've already heard, as well as the really important local and national needs assessments and insights that we're hearing from the community level in terms of critical gaps in losses and damages being experienced by people, communities, and countries. The International Federation of the Red Cross, Red Crescent represents 191 different national societies, each taking local and national action in response to reducing disaster risk, but also increasingly on strengthening climate adaptation, and also seeing some of the major gaps that there are in terms of loss and damage. We also have our expert climate center, which does a lot of work connecting and bridging climate science with basically community insights. And so what I'm hoping to do here is just share a little bit about how does this contextualize within the overall loss and damage policy arena. And so for that, I'm going to share a couple of quick slides purely to illustrate some of these emerging frameworks that we're seeing, as well as to contextualize this within some of the wider global research. I know there are many experts, academics, practitioners joining us on this call today. So to give a kind of a quick stop on some of the kind of key developments, I just wanted to firstly start with the IPCC report, the Working Group 2 report on impacts, adaptation, vulnerability, which was published 2 years ago and was really kind of sizable in terms of laying out what are the current impacts, compiling that. And why that's important for climate negotiations and for global policy making is this is the kind of global template almost through which evidence and insights are developed. How do we respond to the trends that we're seeing, both in terms of local and national needs assessments, but also what is the latest climate science telling us in terms of impacts, gaps, and adaptation. And what was really critical about this this kind of Working Group 2 report was really strongly was the basis through which much of the loss and damage, rapid policy development and responses was born. Our Red Crescent Climate Centre have very helpfully done an easy read summary, which I can share in the chat, on what were some of the key humanitarian impacts that were really coming out through that report. And I just wanted to draw your attention to, of the 8 kind of key insights, the kind of interplay between climate as a kind of a risk multiplier for human mobility, displacement, kind of impacts on kind of peace and stability as well, was one of the kind of key insights, looking at the compounding risks that we see, and also the challenge in terms of lack of adaptation finance, getting to contexts where there's already kind of high levels of displacement leading to further loss and damage. So I wanted to highlight this as a really kind of important piece of work, one in which very much gave birth to the kind of climate negotiations and the basis through which the kind of long requested ask for loss and damage finance was finally worked through. Go into a little bit of contextualizing the kind of policy environment around loss and damage. We've heard many of the colleagues on this webinar talking about economic and non-economic loss and damage, and there's a body of work which has gone through kind of climate policy to try and reflect better the complexity and variety of needs and impacts which are experienced by countries, communities and people as a result of a climate-related event. Understanding that kind of traditional ways of capturing needs is very much focused on immediate needs around food, health, shelter. What are the immediate needs that the people need in terms of protection of life and livelihoods? And this discussion around loss and damage, I think, really helps to step back and say, what matters most to people? What is being captured, not just as a GDP loss or kind of a quick humanitarian needs assessment post-disaster, but what are the profound and real impacts that people and communities experience over time, whether that be directly after an event or in the years and decades afterwards in terms of longer term and building impacts. And so I thought it helpful to just share this. It's in the research brief as well, just the different ways in which non-economic loss and damage can manifest, whether it be at an individual level in terms of, and we've heard colleagues talk about health, mental health impacts, human mobility, forced displacement, as well as across society in terms of basically cultural loss, loss of Indigenous knowledge, as well as to the environment in terms of biodiversity. There's a whole way in which the climate change is impacting our society, our communities. And so this discussion on loss and damage and creating a kind of a global and national framework to better respond is about recognizing these wider losses and damages. And I think trying to put more firmly people, communities and countries at the center of responses and what matters most. I wanted to share that there's been a number of developments and want to share a few things that have been happening here in Bonn, but the big decision on loss and damage was the decision which happened last COP and the COP before in terms of building towards a loss and damage fund and agreeing what should be part of that. We're at the start of this journey and a lot of the elements are still being kind of worked out in terms of how to disperse funding. But what was agreed was this new fund, which is being set up under the kind of UN Climate Convention. So we have funds for mitigation to be able to reduce emissions and support a just transition, on adaptation to be able to support communities and countries to be able to adapt over kind of medium to longer term timeframes linked to the national adaptation plans. But a huge gap in the financial architecture on how do you best respond to loss and damage and what more is required beyond existing humanitarian response and existing development projects, which are really about how our communities being supported to recover in a more resilient way. And the clear gap that has come up time and time again through these discussions has been on displacement, relocation and migration, and saying that there's insufficient support at a community level, at a national level and across boundaries as well to be able to really support people to meet this challenge. And so the kind of foundation of this new loss and damage fund writes into it the need to be able to have finance targeted at addressing this gap. And it also makes mention of what's called the wider funding arrangements, which is to acknowledge that we have existing financial flows limited and not enough across humanitarian actors, development, as well as local municipality budgets and national budgets as well to respond, and calling for coordination between these two areas. What I thought could be helpful in trying to set the context on loss and damage is we know that this is being experienced. We know there's a gap in the financial architecture. We know there's a decision to set up a new fund, and that it needs to be coordinated at the local and national level with local organizations, with local authorities to be able to reach the most vulnerable and to make a real difference. But what we're seeing is this kind of emerging of a new global architecture in finance and global policy to hopefully provide new finance and support to address some of these gaps. And so the three elements, and some of these are being in discussion in Bonn, and I'll give a big update on that, is three different structures. One called the EXCOM, which is a technical body providing support, and there's a specific group on displacement, which brings together practitioners from IOM, UNHCR, different national actors and academics to produce guidance and support on what are some of these gaps of which this research I really hope will feed through as a really important contribution on the discussion of social cohesion. We have this new Santiago network, which will be discussed again in a month's time. And this is to set up a technical body to be able to provide support to countries requesting support in responding to loss and damage. So that might be saying there's a gap in displacement. We need greater support and technical assistance on how to respond to social cohesion, what kind of integrated programs. That can be requested of this Santiago network. And finally, the loss and damage fund to actually disperse new finance to countries, and has a question of a community access model as well, which is still being worked through, and we expect decisions to be made ahead of this COP and dispersal of funding. We know that displacement is a key thematic priority. So again, I think being aware of how that's shifting over time, how we can bring some of this research and learning on the non-economic losses, which are more difficult, but are possible to measure and are so important to people and communities to be tackled, that we're bringing this evidence and insight in order that we're getting more holistic, integrated and better responses to deal with gaps and what communities want and need. I'll stop there and look forward to the discussion.
Thanks so much, Mary. And it's great to also see how that fits into what's going on on the international scene, where there is a lot of movement now. Well, we could always wish to see more, but there's movement, which is good. All right, so now we're going to move on to a panel discussion. So I'm going to invite all of my speakers to join me here. And we also will have joining us Olivier Magwaniza, who is mental health and psychosocial support delegate from the Danish Red Cross, also located in Niamey, Niger, and working with social support, including social cohesion, also in Niger. All right, so we have a couple of questions to start with, question and comment. So if there are other questions out there, please just put them up in the Q&A. The first one is a great question. Also, many thanks for your great presentations. What are some specific local solutions proposed by community members that could be highlighted in the report? So that's one, and I'm going to just pull together a few. But maybe Olivier and Francis, if you could speak a little bit to that, what kind of suggestions came out? And a comment for future study is about using a longitudinal perspective, so being able to document change over time. Maybe Francis, you can talk a little bit about how we did that, tried to document change over time, despite not having data from previous years. And I can see there are more coming up. If we can start with those, then I'll get an overview of the questions and we'll get back.
Okay.
Yeah, Olivier, start us off. Thanks.
Okay, thank you, and thank you for the presentations. If I try maybe to contribute to respond to the first question, what could we understand as the solutions that people highlighted? First one is it was highlighted into the previous presentations, which is really to promote the culturally sensitive and inclusive approaches. So when we talk to the populations and even from our other community feedback mechanisms that we conducted, always people want that nobody is left behind when it comes to the displacement dynamics. So when people leave their place to live with others coming from maybe different communities, they really want to be together to build that sense of belongingness, that togetherness, and also humanitarian actors should really play a role into promoting these inclusive approaches. So it's really it is something which came at several times that people, they want, even if when we respond to humanitarian needs, to understand the how people can even promote that sense of nobody is left out or is not left behind. That's one. The second one is it's really important to see how people are eager to activate themselves, these social networks we have been talking about. So when we talk to people, they want really that when you come up with solutions, recognize the capacity of the people and how they can even contribute at responding to these components we have been talking about. Really, the material support needs at some point to understand it works well when there is a social support behind, and the social support comes within the community itself. So really promoting the localized approaches, the inclusive approaches is something which was mentioned from the community themselves. Thank you.
Great, Olivier. And Francis, do you have some input?
Yes, thank you, Olivier. That was really interesting. So in the case of Ghana, the respondents were really very particular about one strategy that they would mention every time, everywhere. It's about assistance to help them adapt to changes in the agrarian system. And climate changes is one of the things they point to. So they want strategies that will help them adapt to this farm livelihood system so they can continue to benefit from it. And there are a lot of them. So they're talking of better seeds, drought-resistant seeds. They are talking about also markets for certain products. So at least they are talking about rural routes that go interior to their farms, because there's a trend of extensification. They want to be able to reach more fertile lands. Okay, so although this might relate somehow to maladaptation, because they kind of cutting down more vegetation to do this, but this can be done in a more well-planned manner. It's also interesting, people talk so much about livelihood diversification, and they want to have more infrastructure and support to be able to do this. But they also then speak about bias towards men, that most NGOs and international organizations, even government, concentrate so much on women that they sometimes bring frictions in the household between the men and the women, because they narrate that in some cases the women are better resourced than the men, and that's really beginning to unsettle their cohesion. So it might be that we may have to rethink how we have conducted some of these strategies over time, and whether they are really helping solve some problems, but they are also potentially causing other problems. I would move to the second question as well, that speak about how we capture change over time when in fact we did this work within a space of a month, 6 months or so. So first we asked about perceived changes when it comes to the environment. So we speak about temperature, we speak about rainfall, we speak about other parameters, including wind. Then we are also we also get information from people about the experiences over time. They have lived these experiences and they can tell it to us through interviews and also through focus group discussions. Then we have also referred to studies that have done long-term calculations in temperature and rainfall to be able to understand the trends that occur in this study area.
Great, thanks, Francis. So we have a few more questions coming out, and one is, could you comment on any topics or areas that you believe are important to investigate further to better understand this? And this was kind of, there was a background to this question that was, I can imagine that additional questions kind of came out during the research. And so that's one. There's a question about how insights from kind of different disciplines, psychology, sociology, or economics might be able to contribute to better understandings. And then we also have, as if we explored vertical dimensions of social cohesion. I can just quickly answer that one and say we focus more on horizontal, so among communities and groups. If you are working paper coming out soon, we'll have a little bit on vertical relationships due to access to support and infrastructure. There's some data on that. All right, so if we could answer these questions on any kind of diverse disciplinary perspectives, but also any surprises and kind of more questions that came up during the research. I think Laura talked a bit about this in her presentation, yeah. So maybe Laura, if you could give us a few words on that, and Francis, and if you could just try and keep it brief. We have a few more questions if we can manage.
Yes, sure. Thank you so much. So indeed, it was the overall result of this research for Niger, at least, was quite surprising, as I said, because we were not expecting to see such gains over time for a lot of those factors associated with social cohesion. So from my end, and what we discussed as well within the team was really to try to understand better what factors can be driving this forward. So also to answer the second question, I think here everything that is anthropology or sociology could really help us understand, because first of all, there are very strong cultural and social dynamics at the basis of this research that we would need to look into through a more qualitative methodology. On a more technical level, it could be interesting to see how livelihood activities and everything targeting food security is helping and could help in the future reinforce this social cohesion, because we have been talking about pressure on natural resources and the people flocking from rural areas towards more urban areas. So really additional resources put additional pressure, put on the environmental resources available in very limited areas. So I think those could be two areas that we should look into in the future, and in terms of programming as well, just to name a couple.
Great, thanks, Laura. And Francis, do you have anything to add?
Well, I think that's really nice. Laura really speaks well when she talks about how things change over time. And I thought that exploring social transformation as a broad concept would really be useful in understanding and unraveling some of these things about social cohesion, because the driving factors are quite wide. And if you really look at how the society has been changing over time and what is causing this change, then it helps to understand better what is going on. And I'm certain that economists would provide very good analysis of this, what has been driving the global economy, the demands for resources, supply of resources, and also in terms of pricing of goods coming from the developing world also, who is determining this price and what negotiations go on. We also can look more into wider negotiations, like what we have heard already from Mary about negotiations about climate change loss and damage, who is contributed to this fund, how much of their GDP is coming in. I mean, when Africa has really contributed so little to causing climate change. Then, of course, we have also seen the importance of looking at land tenure more closely, because this has been very important in some of the stories we have heard. Of course, this would be the role of sociologists and also, of course, economists come in. And of course, livelihood changes over time that we see many economists and sociologists also taking part. And of course, we have to also delve deeper into the role of mobility in all of this.
Great, thanks. Yeah, I think across countries, I mean, the role of resource access, land access, livelihoods were really coming out clearly, just to, I mean, going back to that multidisciplinary approach and the importance. So just going to the last couple of questions, and then we're going to wrap up. And so we have one that's kind of looking at this intersection between climate change and conflict, and about a previous seminar at my institution, actually, that looked at how climate change can also lead to loss of identity, and that was talked about at a seminar that was actually about climate change and conflict. And so there was an example of how a farmer might lose his ability to farm his land, or fisherman his ability to live, or her ability to make a living from fishing, and how these could affect identity. And I mean, identity is also often brought up in discussions of social cohesion. So maybe we can just talk about that one briefly. And then there was a last question on the role of technology. Do we see what role for technology in potentially enhancing social cohesion? And so maybe a final word from Olivier and from Francis. And then Mary, if you see anything coming out of these discussions, you know, linking back to that policy level, let's just also bring that in at the end. But maybe Olivier, starting with you.
Thank you. I will start maybe how we work, the current interventions contribute to social cohesion, and how we work with state institutions. Laura had mentioned a little bit how we work with the peace consolidation, higher institution at the government level, but also it is important to see how we work with local leaders and how they really facilitate these community dialogues when it comes to any kind of these climate-related issues and the social cohesion. So it's really the local community leaders who should really help to understand what are the potential dividers in relation to any context, and what are the connectors that we are seeing can bring people together. So there is really a role that the current interventions are doing in that aspect, so that really it's community-led interventions where people analyze themselves, assess what can we do, what are the challenges, and how can we respond together as a community. So the local institutions has a role. But also, Laura mentioned something about evidence-based networking, promoting humanitarian advocacy. This is something which, moving forward, we need to reinforce with such findings. We think this is an evidence which can help us contribute to the higher level discussions. So
Thank
about
you.
the
I think we might
Anika,
have to move on if we're going to get to everybody before we wrap up. But thank you for that. I think there were some really good points to end on, Olivier, the ones that you've just brought up. And Francis, a little bit from your side. And if Mary is still with us, we can also maybe come around to her before we wrap up.
Well, I'd just like to re-emphasize Olivier's point of coming from the grassroots, of actually understanding people's perceptions and also experiences over time about the drivers of change and how this influences cohesion, and also getting their responses about what can be done, and then it can inform policies at different scales. I think this is what I like to really emphasize on. And also, we need to understand social cohesion from a much more ground level. We do not need to take up definitions across the world and just import them down like that. We need to actually look at what is down there, what's real. How do people really understand it?
Thank you so much to all of you, our speakers. Mary has unfortunately dropped out here at the last moment, so we are not able to hear from her in our wrap up. But It's been a pleasure to have all of you. Thanks so much for joining. You can find additional information on our website. We have the outputs, the policy brief that just came out yesterday, our report that really goes into depth, and additional data coming out soon. So stay tuned. Thanks and have a great day.